She was 19 years old, and she had $2 in the pocket of a borrowed coat, and on the morning this story begins, she stood in the ashes of a burned bank and bought it while the whole town laughed. Her name was Sadie Coburn, and the thing she bought was the ruin of the Merchants and Miners Bank of Ellsworth, in the high plains of Kansas, a building that had burned to a black shell 40 years before and had stood ever since a charred skeleton at the head of the town's main street, roofless, gutted, its walls stained with old smoke. A monument to the worst day in the history of the town. And at the back of that ruin, standing untouched among the char, was the one thing the fire had not destroyed. The great iron vault, its heavy round door shut fast, exactly as it had been on the night the bank burned, and never once opened since. The people of Ellsworth called it the Dead Vault, for the vault of the Merchants and Miners had not been opened in 40 years, and the reason it had not been opened was the reason the whole town carried a grief it had never set down. On the night the bank burned, 40 years before, the vault had been full. It had held the savings of the whole town, the deposits of every family in Ellsworth, the payrolls and the specie and the slow gathered money of a generation, and when the fire came in the night it came fast, and the banker died in it, and by morning the bank was a smoking shell. But the vault had held. The great iron vault was fireproof, built to survive exactly such a night, and it had survived, standing whole and shut in the ruin of the burned bank, and the town had breathed again, believing its money safe inside. The fire itself had passed into the legend of the town, told and retold until it had the shape of a thing out of Scripture. It had started in the night, no one ever knew how, in the dry heart of a dry summer, and it had taken the bank so fast that the banker, an old careful man named Elias Thorne, who slept in a room above his bank as bankers of that day often did, had not been able to get out, and had died trying, it was said, to reach the vault and save the town's money with his own hands. By the time the town formed its bucket line, the bank was an inferno, and there was nothing to do but stand in the street and watch it burn and pray the vault would hold, for every family in Ellsworth had its life savings inside it. And in the morning, when the ashes cooled, the vault was there, black with smoke but whole, shut fast. And a great ragged cheer had gone up from the exhausted townspeople, for they believed their money saved. It was only in the days after, when they tried to open it and could not, that the cheer turned slowly to the 40-year grief, as it came clear that the fire had taken from them not the money itself, but the one thing that could ever unlock it. The old banker and the combination he carried in his head alone. And then they had tried to open it, and could not. For the banker had died in the fire, and the combination to the vault had died with him, and no one else had ever held it, and the vault of the Merchants and Miners was the finest that money could buy, built to defeat fire and thief alike, and it had defeated, in the 40 years since, every attempt to open it. They had brought locksmiths from Kansas City. They had brought a safe expert all the way from Chicago. They had tried, in the desperate early years, drills and charges and once a whole day's labor with a steam-driven bore, and the vault had beaten all of them. Its walls too thick, its door too hard, its lock past any picking. And one by one the experts had gone away shaking their heads and saying the same thing, that the vault could be opened, in time by main force, but that the cost of opening it, in labor and machinery and ruined equipment, would come to more than anyone knew for certain was inside, and that no one would pay to open a vault that might, for all anyone living could say, have burned empty after all. And so the dead vault had stood, shut, in the ruin of the burned bank, for 40 years. The town of Ellsworth had never recovered from the loss. Half its families had been ruined in a night, their savings sealed forever behind an iron door they could not open, and could not prove held anything at all, and the town had shrunk and soured, and the burned bank at the head of the street had become the emblem of everything Ellsworth had lost, a thing the town could neither use, nor tear down, nor bear to look at, and the county had held the worthless title to it for 2 generations, and would have given it to anyone. Sadie Coburn gave them $2 for it. She had come to that hour by a hard road, as the girls in these stories do. Sadie had been orphaned young and raised by her grandfather, the old mason, in a small house at the edge of Ellsworth, and those had been the good years of her life. Poor but warm, for the old man had loved her and had taught her, and had filled her childhood with the stories of his building days and the feel of tools in her hands. But her grandfather had died when she was 15, and after that Sadie had been passed to an aunt by marriage, a sour, grasping woman who had taken the girl in for the small labor she could get out of her, and had never once let her forget the cost of her keep. Sadie had worked in that house 4 years, cooking and scrubbing and holding her tongue. And when at last the aunt's patience with a grown niece who ate and must be clothed ran out, the woman had turned Sadie into the street with the clothes on her back and a borrowed coat she had not even meant to lend, and told her to make her own way, for the world owed her nothing. And Sadie Coburn, standing in the road with nothing, 19 years old and alone, had felt the old cold clarity that comes to a person who has finally lost the last thing there was to lose, and in that clarity she had remembered her grandfather's story of the vault. And she had understood, all at once, what she must do. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Sadie Coburn, and the burned bank, and the dead vault that had never turned in 40 years. And if a story of a whole town's lost hope and a patient girl who would not accept it is what you came for tonight, light a lantern with us, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where in this wide country you are watching from. We are always glad of the company here in the dark. The county clerk had laughed when she asked to buy it, and the men lounging in his office had laughed, and the laughter had followed her out into the street, for it was a great joke in Ellsworth that the Coburn girl, who had nothing, who had just been turned out of her aunt's house with the clothes on her back, had spent her last $2 to buy the one thing in the county that everyone knew was worthless. A burned ruin with a locked box in it that 40 years and a dozen experts had failed to open. They laughed at her the way a town laughs at a fool, and Sadie Coburn walked through the laughter with her chin up and said nothing, for she had learned, in a hard life, that there is a kind of strength in silence, and that a person who does not argue with mockery gives it nothing to feed on. But Sadie Coburn was not a fool, and she had not bought the burned bank out of foolishness or desperation, though she was desperate enough. She had bought it because of a thing she knew that no one else in Ellsworth knew, a thing that had been given to her by her grandfather, and that she had carried, waiting for the day she might be able to use it. For Sadie Coburn's grandfather, dead these 10 years, had been a builder. He had been, in his young days, a mason and a builder of the old, careful, thorough kind, and he had come to Ellsworth as a young man in the town's first days, when it was new and growing and full of hope, and he had worked on the raising of its buildings, and among the buildings he had helped to build was the Merchants' and Miners' Bank. He had told Sadie of it when she was a girl, for the old liked to tell the young of the things they made, and he had told her, in particular, of the vault, because the building of the vault had been the proudest and most particular work of his young life. And he had told her a thing about the vault that no one else in Ellsworth remembered, because everyone who had known it was dead, and because it was the kind of thing that only the man who built a thing would know. He had told her that the vault of the Merchants and Miners had been built in a hurry. The bank had wanted its vault, and wanted it fast. In the boom days when money was pouring into the town, and every day the vault was not finished was a day of business lost. And the great iron vault door, the fireproof armored door that was the heart of the thing, had been ordered from the east and shipped out by rail, and it had come late, and the bank had not wanted to wait. And so, her grandfather told her, they had built the vault around the delay. They had raised the great vault chamber of brick and iron and stone, thick-walled and fireproof, all but the doorway, and they had left the doorway framed and ready for the armored door that was coming, and when at last the door arrived they had hung it and finished the front of the vault in a rush. But the back of the vault, the rear wall, the wall against the alley that no one would ever see and no thief could ever reach, that wall her grandfather and his fellows had built in the ordinary way, of good brick, thick and sound, but only brick. for it did not need to be more, since the front was armored and the sides were stone, and no one would ever come at a bank vault through its back wall, against a blind alley. Her grandfather had not told her this as a secret, nor as a thing that mattered. He had told it to her as a builder's story, a small, proud memory of a young man's working days, the kind of thing an old man tells, because the telling brings the good years back. She remembered the evening of it clearly, years later, the two of them by the fire in the little house. The old man's hands, gnarled now but still a mason's hands, shaping the vault in the air as he described it, and the pride in his voice, and the small rueful laugh when he told how they had cut the corner on the back wall to make up the lost time, and how the bank directors had fretted over it and he had told them not a soul would ever know or care. For whoever heard of robbing a bank through the back of its vault? He had been right. For 40 years, not a soul had known or cared. The one weakness in the great vault of Ellsworth had been a builder's private memory, and it had lived only in the head of one old mason, and it would have died with him, unregarded if he had not happened, one quiet evening, to tell it to a granddaughter who listened, and who remembered, and who would one day have nothing left in all the world but that memory and the tools he left her. The vault was a fortress at its door and a fortress at its sides, but its back was only brick. And her grandfather, who had laid that brick with his own young hands, had told his granddaughter of it, one quiet evening, as an old man tells a story, never dreaming what it would one day be worth. And Sadie Coburn, standing turned out and penniless in the street of a town that had just laughed at her, had remembered it, and had understood with a slow-rising certainty that the dead vault of Ellsworth, which had defeated 40 years and a dozen experts at its armored door, had a back wall of nothing but old brick, and that every one of those experts had failed for the same reason. They had all attacked the vault at the one place it was built to be strong, and not one of them had ever thought to walk around to the alley and look at its back. The work of it was the work of a month, and Sadie did it mostly alone, and she did it not with the machinery and the main force that had failed for 40 years, but with a mason's patience, for she was a mason's granddaughter, and she had listened, as a girl, to how such things were truly done. She did not touch the vault door. She left it exactly as it was, shut and armored and untouched, the great round door that the whole town had battered itself against for 2 generations, and she went instead around to the alley behind the burned bank, the blind, narrow alley against the vault's back wall, where no one had looked in 40 years because there had never been anything there to look at but a blank brick wall stained with old smoke. And she studied that wall the way her grandfather had taught her to study a wall, and she saw that it was as he had said, good brick, thick and sound, but only brick. And 40 years of Kansas weather, of the freeze and the thaw and the driving rain, had done to the mortar between those bricks what no drill had ever done to the armored door, softening it, crumbling it, opening the fine seams between the courses. She could not knock the wall down, it was too thick and too sound for that, and, besides, she did not want to knock it down. For she had begun to think carefully now, and she understood that whatever was inside must be reached without harm and without noise, for a girl who had bought a vault full of a town's lost savings would do well not to advertise the opening of it until the law could be there, to see it done honestly. So she did it the slow, quiet, patient way, the mason's way. She took her grandfather's own tools, which were the one thing her aunt had let her keep, an old brick hammer and a set of cold chisels and a pointing trowel worn thin with a dead man's work, and she began, in the blind alley, in the early mornings before the town was awake, to take the back wall of the vault apart one brick at a time. It was slow work, and careful, and she did it in the cool dark of the mornings, and rested in the heat of the day, following the softened mortar seams her grandfather's weather had opened for her, working her chisel into the crumbling joints, and easing each brick loose from its bed, and lifting it out whole, and setting it aside in careful stacks, so that the wall came apart not in a ruin of broken rubble, but in an orderly unbuilding, brick by brick, the exact reverse of the building her grandfather had done 40 years before. Her grandfather had taught her the whole of it without ever knowing what he was preparing her for. He had taught her that mortar is the weakness and the strength of any brick wall both, that a wall stands not by the bricks alone but by the mortar that binds them, and that mortar, unlike brick, does not last forever, but softens and crumbles with the years and the weather, so that an old wall can be taken apart at its joints by a patient hand where a new one could not. He had taught her to read a wall, to find the courses where the weather had got in, to work with the wall's own aging rather than against its remaining strength. He had taught her never to hurry, for a hurried mason cracks the brick he means to save and brings down more than he meant to move, and Sadie, working alone in the gray dawn light of the alley, went slow and saved every brick whole, and stacked them in their courses as neat as her grandfather would have wished. She worked for a month. Her hands blistered and then hardened into a mason's hands, her grandfather's hands, and she came to feel, in the strange communion of the work, that he was there in the alley with her, that his patience was in her chisel and his knowledge in her fingers, and that the two of them together, the dead mason and his living granddaughter, were undoing across 40 years the one wall he had built weak. For her. She thought, as she worked, of her grandfather's young hands laying these same bricks in hope in the town's first days, and of her own hands taking them down again in hope in the town's last, and it seemed to her that she was not destroying his work, but completing it, that he had built her a door into the vault 40 years before and told her where to find it, and that all she was doing now was opening the door he had left her. And there was a justice in it that went deeper than the money. For her grandfather had helped to build the bank that held the town's hope, and had died before he could see it burn and fail, and now his granddaughter would be the one to give that hope back, so that the family of the mason who raised the vault would be the family that opened it at last. It was as though the whole long story had been waiting 40 years to close its circle, and needed only a girl with the right memory and the right tools and the patience to work in the cold, dawn a brick at a time. And at the end of the month she took out the last brick, and she looked through the hole she had made in the back of the vault, into the dark that 40 years had sealed, and she saw what the dead vault of Ellsworth had held all along. It was there. All of it. The savings of the whole town, sealed 40 years behind an iron door and a brick wall, kept perfect and dry in the fireproof dark. The strong boxes of specie, the sacks of coin, the drawers of banknotes, the deposit books and the ledgers, the whole lost fortune of Ellsworth, that the fire had not burned, and the vault had not yielded, and the town had mourned for 2 generations as gone forever. It had never burned. It had never been lost. It had only been locked, behind a door no one could open, in a vault whose back wall no one had ever thought to look at, and it had waited, in the dark, for a mason's granddaughter to remember what a mason had told her, and to come around to the alley, and to take down, one patient brick at a time, the door he had left her. Sadie Coburn did not, in that moment, reach in and fill her pockets. She was a careful girl, and an honest one, and she understood exactly what she had found, and exactly how it must be handled, for this was not treasure with no owner, like gold from a wreck at the bottom of the sea. This was the named, recorded, deposited savings of the people of Ellsworth, and every dollar of it belonged to someone, or to someone's heirs, and it was written down in the very deposit books that lay inside the vault whose names those dollars were. She put the last brick back loosely in its place, and she covered the hole, and she told no one, and she walked into town, and she went not to the men who had laughed at her, but to the one authority in the county that stood outside the town's old griefs and grudges, the district judge, an old and honest man named Ambrose Wills, who had come to Ellsworth long after the fire and owed nothing to anyone in it. She laid it all before Judge Wills, who she was, and what her grandfather had built, and what he had told her, and what she had found behind the brick. And she asked him, plainly, to come and see the vault opened lawfully, and to see to it that what was inside was returned to the people it belonged to, and Judge Wills, who had spent a long life learning to tell an honest person from a scheming one, looked at the girl a long while, and then he put on his coat and came with her to see. What followed was the thing that the town of Ellsworth would tell for the rest of its days. Judge Wills came to the burned bank with the county officers and a gathering crowd, for word had spread, and he had the last bricks taken down from the back of the vault in the sight of all of them, lawfully, with witnesses. And the whole town of Ellsworth stood in the ashes of the burned bank and watched, 40 years too late, the lost savings of their grandparents come out of the dead vault into the light of day. It was a strange and solemn gathering, that morning in the ashes. Word had run through Ellsworth like the fire itself, and they came from every corner of the town and the country around it, the old and the young, the grandchildren of families ruined in the burning, come to see with their own eyes the thing they had been told all their lives could never be. There was a hush on them as the last bricks came down, a held breath 40 years long, and when Judge Wills reached into the opened back of the vault and drew out the first strongbox and set it in the light, and it was sound, and heavy, and full. A sound went through the crowd that was not a cheer, for it was too deep for cheering, but a kind of low broken murmur, the sound of a grief that has carried a town for 2 generations letting go all at once. Old men who had been children on the night of the fire wept openly. Women held their grandchildren up to see. And they wept, many of them, old people who had grown up poor in the shadow of a loss they had thought could never be undone, watching the strongboxes and the coin and the deposit books come out of the dark, and they turned to look at the girl they had laughed at a month before, the penniless Coburn girl who had bought the burned bank for $2, and who had opened in a single month the vault that 40 years and a dozen experts had failed to open, and had come straight to the law with it rather than taking a cent. And the laughter of Ellsworth turned, in that hour, to something the town had not felt in 40 years, which was gratitude. The deposit books were opened, and they were sound, 40 years dry and perfect, and every account was named and recorded in the banker's own careful hand, and over the following years the money was returned, dollar by named dollar, to the families of Ellsworth or to their heirs, tracked down one by one through the very records the vault had kept. Old wrongs were mended. Farms that had been lost for want of the savings, sealed in the vault, were, in some measure, restored to the grandchildren of those who had lost them. A town that had been dying for 40 years, poisoned by an old loss it could not undo, drew a breath and began, slowly, to live again, and the burned bank at the head of the street, which had been the emblem of everything Ellsworth had lost, became instead the emblem of a thing recovered. And Sadie Coburn, who could have slipped away in the night with a fortune and had not, was rewarded, as honesty in these stories has a way of being. For though the deposits were not hers, the law and the grateful town together saw to it that the girl who had recovered them was not left with nothing. The county paid her a finder's reward, and the families whose savings she had restored pressed upon her more, and Judge Wills himself saw that she was given the burned bank and its ground free and clear, and Sadie Coburn, who had come to that hour with $2 and a borrowed coat, found herself, at 19, no longer poor, and no longer laughed at, but honored in the town that had mocked her. She did not leave Ellsworth. She stayed, and she did with her reward a thing that would have made her grandfather proud. She rebuilt the burned bank, not as a bank, for the town was too poor and too changed for that, but as a solid, useful building at the head of the main street, raised up out of the char with her grandfather's own tools and her own hardened mason's hands, and the help of the men the recovered money put back to work, and she made of it a hall for the town, a place for its gatherings and its records and its hope, and she built into the wall of it, where all could see, the great iron vault door of the merchants and miners, cleaned and mounted but never again shut, standing open forever now, a monument no longer to what the town had lost but to what a patient girl had given it back. She laid the new walls herself, or much of them, for she found she could not give up the trade her grandfather had left her, and there was a rightness in a Coburn's hands, raising up the building a Coburn had helped to raise the first time. She taught the young men who worked with her the things the old man had taught her, the reading of a wall and the patience of the mortar, and the rule that a mason never hurries, and in this way her grandfather's knowledge, which had so nearly died with them, passed on instead into a new generation of the town's builders. And Sadie Coburn lived a long life in Ellsworth, respected and unhurried, a mason and a woman of substance, and she married in time and raised children. And she told them, as her grandfather had told her, the stories of the building days, for she had learned better than most the worth of a story passed down, having seen a whole town's fortune ride for 40 years on a single old man's memory, and come back to the light because a girl had listened. She had been 19 years old, and turned out with nothing, and down to $2 in a borrowed coat, and she had spent every cent of it on a burned ruin that a whole town swore was worth nothing but the memory of the worst day it had ever known. It was the best $2 she ever spent. There is a thing worth carrying out of a story like this one, and it is not the fortune recovered, though that was a great good. It is that the hardest doors in this life are so often locked only at the front. For 40 years the whole strength and cleverness of a town and a dozen hired experts had hurled itself at the armored door of the dead vault, because the door was where the vault asked to be attacked, where it stood and dared them, and 40 years of that assault had accomplished exactly nothing. And a penniless girl opened it in a month, not because she was stronger or cleverer than all of them, but only because she knew from an old man's story that the fortress had a back wall of ordinary brick, and because she had the humility to stop battering at the strong front and walk quietly around to the weak back and do the patient work. Whatever door in your own life has beaten you at the front, remember the dead vault of Ellsworth. Everything that is armored at the front was very likely built in a hurry at the back. So we will leave you tonight with a question, and we do read every answer. Is there a locked door in your own life? Some problem that has defeated you at the front for years, that might have a plain brick-back wall you have never thought to walk around and look at? Tell us in the comments below. Light a lantern with us, subscribe if this story kept you company tonight, and we will see you down the line, where the next story is already waiting in the dark.